In a world of knee-jerk personality politics where us lot get drowned out by the most powerful, most angry or most offended, this is a show which cuts through the noise, helps you understand the facts behind the issues and gets your voice back in the debate. We'll be saying no to partisan politics and going after the cold, hard facts, however uncomfortable the truth might be. Among the topics this week, have Extinction Rebellion gone too far? Or should they go further even? Are the BBC biased? And do politicians really care how the public feel? This is the Midson Project. I'm Richard Midson. I'm on a mission to repair democracy. Well, at least do my bit to help. Also, later on, we'll be discussing in our masterclass section how you can get your voice heard too, whether you want to launch a local campaign or be heard on one of today's issues. Plus, if you don't agree with one of my guests, don't throw things at your TV or at your mobile device, as one person told me they felt like doing last time. As you watch this or listen to this, make sure you come onto the show instead. Don't just whinge, tell us what it is you're thinking and why you think that too. There is just one rule, as I say, leave your partisan politics at the door and come armed with some facts. Remember, this is a show where you get to vote on the issues. So whether you're on a train to work at some point in the future or watching live on a giant TV on your sofa right now, grab your device, go to themidsonproject.com/episode 2 and get ready to enter your thoughts. I'll be repeating that link throughout the show as well. A couple of things before we get started too. A huge thank you to everyone who messaged me after the pilot episode. There were some fantastic ideas and feedback, and it was great to also hear from other political parties too who wanted to take part, and I can't wait to get everyone involved. As I mentioned before, we're kicking off with one guest to make things easier to test this show and all the technical bits that you don't get to see. But then I hope we can get as wide-ranging guests and as wide-ranging discussion as possible, and also getting you asking questions too. Two other things I'd like your thoughts on. Firstly, I created a list of rules for the show, which you can find at themidsonproject.com/rules. Do let me know what you think about them. And second, what do you think about a particular weekday maybe for actually doing this show live? Do you have any preferences? I've added the 2 questions to the poll for this week at themidsonproject.com/episode 2. So what will you think this week? Let's get started on our first question for this week. Go on to social media, and the general running tone is that the Conservative Party, the governing party in the UK, is out of touch with the voters. It only appeals to people from older generations or rich public school pupils and doesn't understand the needs of the average Briton. Now, I know that sounds like a partisan point, but actually it's not, because the same can be said for Labour and Jeremy Corbyn. You don't have to go far to hear views that he's too left-wing, too radical, and his views do not represent anyone but the hard left members who put him into position. The same can be said of all parties. It's very easy to say that all politicians are out of touch, but are they? Logic suggests in order to get elected, a politician needs to be able to get you or me to vote for them. They have to connect with us in some way, don't they? And if you accept the point my guest made last time, then you can only be persuaded so far. In which case, politicians have to come at least close to representing us, right? But let's put a counterpoint to this. When there are so few parties, do politicians have to care if there's so little choice? There was a time, of course, when politicians were literally our representatives. They had to be, due to the slow pace of communications. We literally had to send someone to do their best to represent us. But now there are no excuses. But let's just throw one more point in the mix here before I bring in my guest. And perhaps this is one that is quite an uncomfortable one. Should they be listening to us? As social media in the world becomes more divided and more entrenched in rival camps, and politics becomes more extreme, do we actually need a political class again who rises above this and decides what is in our best interests? Should they, in fact, not be listening to us? So, are politicians out of touch with the public? Yes or no? I am delighted to have with me a person who's been at the heart of Conservative politics for many years. He helped to organise the youth side of the party and now is one of the team coordinating and organising Conservative Progress, which reaches out to future Conservative activists and provides training for them as well. Luke Springthorpe, thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. I've got to ask you, what are your thoughts about this? Are politicians out of touch with the public? What do you think?
Well, I've got to say, I think events over the last week and especially this weekend definitely show that. I think if you were to speak to most people at the moment, what they're saying is they want to get Brexit done. They certainly want to see the result of the referendum respected. And what you're seeing is just politicians delaying again and again. And I just think they're completely out of touch for the most part.
Wouldn't the argument to that, though, straight away be, well, look, this is democracy. There is the whole Brexit debate split the country. You've got half of MPs saying no, half of MPs saying yes, and that's democracy at work, I suppose would be the counter-argument.
I guess the difference is that the public voted a majority to leave, and now you have a majority of MPs doing everything in their power to distort it. And I think actually you saw some of the tweets and comments from MPs where initially, just a few weeks ago, they were saying they expected Boris Johnson to go to Brussels and to get a deal. That was the important thing. It was to go away and get a better deal for the UK and to ensure that we didn't have a hard Brexit. Now, then all of a sudden yesterday you had comments of MPs, and you had Keir Starmer on Andrew Marr's show this morning saying that they were celebrating that it was actually an opportunity to table an amendment to have a second referendum. So actually you've got just the duplicity of saying just a few weeks ago that actually it was about avoiding one thing, and then all of a sudden the mask slips. And it was nothing to do with.
But is this ultimately, I know Brexit is obviously such a huge issue, but putting the Brexit aside, is this actually just politicians listening to the public there? Because this whole question about do politicians listen to the public anymore, isn't this democracy at work?
Well, that's hard to believe. I can't remember the exact figure, but I think about 2/3 of their seats voted to leave. So by that logic, if they're listening to their constituents, then there should be a clear majority of MPs going in the lobby and voting for some form of Brexit, rather than constantly trying to subvert it. So I think what we've seen, frankly, is Brexit is just the incident that's happened in recent history. But I think what we've seen is a gradual decay of politicians just increasingly becoming disconnected. I think, obviously.
But do you think this is going for, these are these big headline issues. Do you think we've actually got a big fundamental problem here where politicians of all sides are not listening to the public?
I think some are better than others. Look, I've met some MPs that are, and councillors as well. I think it's easy to, when we talk about politicians, to think about the people that we see on television all the time. I think there's a lot of, really fantastic councillors at your local level that
we're never hearing about.
Yeah, and they're certainly not doing it for the money or anything, because there is no money there. And the people knocking on your door, they're all volunteers. So, look, when we talk about politicians, it's easy to get very frustrated at the people in Westminster. But assuming we're talking about the people in Westminster, I definitely think there's become this isolation. And I think we've seen it with some of the Conservative MPs, the so-called 21, where these guys have been in safe Conservative seats, often in, as I say, areas that voted to leave the European Union, selected by Conservative members. Now, people in those kind of seats, that they're always going to vote Conservative. And it's almost like some of these MPs have over time thought, well, because I'm in a safe seat, it's almost carte blanche for me to do whatever the heck I like.
If you think about it, if you're an MP and you're safe, whichever party you're from, you're gonna relax a bit, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think that's something in British politics that really has to change. I know in America, I'm not necessarily advocating that we go the full hog, because over there it can be very cutthroat. It's not uncommon at all to see long-standing congressmen and senators that actually get deposed because they frequently have to contest primaries to get reselected. So if all of a sudden they start thinking, well, sod my local party and the voters, I'm going to stand on what I think is right, then they'll probably face the chop pretty quickly. So I think we have to have some kind of mechanism, because a lot of, on the first past the post, a lot of the seats aren't actually really contested in elections.
So let's ask that question then. If politicians are getting out of touch with the public, how do we tighten it up then? You're talking about maybe making them get to the point where they have to stand each time, potentially. What else can we actually do, though?
It's a two-way process. One is, I think the parties have to become more democratic. I think there certainly needs to be more openness, transparency, and regular involvement of members in actually reselecting their MP. So I don't think
What
that
about
we.
from your average person sitting on, if you're not involved in the party though,
Well,
for someone
that's what
sitting
I
at
was
home
going to
right
come on
now
to
watching this going,
next.
look, I'm angry about this and they're not listening to me. What could be done to help your average person?
Well, I think it's a two-way process. So that's what I'm saying in terms of what parties could do. But I actually think it's also incumbent on people, actually, because I think it's all well and good to say, well, politicians aren't doing what I want, and I think it's easy to sit back and to sit in your armchair and say it's all a load of rubbish. But actually, I think what people need to get in the mentality of doing is actually taking part in the debate. Now, I think it's great that people do that on social media and things, and I think that's one way of doing it. But I actually think there is no substitute for um, getting involved in a party, and I think that the ability to shape the debate actually very suddenly you find that politicians are a lot closer than you think. You will come into contact with your local MP a lot more than you ever thought you would, and actually it can be a frustrating process, and I think you suddenly have to consign yourself to the fact that things don't happen overnight. It's like working for a big company, for example. You might be sitting there thinking, "Well, there's so many things I'd do differently," but the CEO sits upstairs, and but actually, if you stick at it, I think there's an awful lot that can be achieved. And I certainly think that a lot could be achieved if people started re-engaging with parties. But I think it's a two-way process.
Interesting. I remember being at your event earlier this year where I was talking to cabinet ministers behind the stage. And it is funny, the moment that the cameras are off, and the moment that they're not under that pressure of having to deliver a perfect line, they are, whether you agree with the policies that they're saying or not, they're just people trying to do their best. And I think this applies all sides. It really does. It applies. Whether you like Nigel Farage, he's doing what he believes is right. Whether you like Jeremy Corbyn, he's doing what he believes is right. And I think often is missed the fact that these are actually people.
Yeah, precisely. And I think the fact that a lot of politicians are disconnected from politics, it's no condemnation of their character or anything. I think a lot of these people, they are, even now, what they're doing, I think, is often motivated by the best of intentions. But I think politicians, at the end of the day, they're conditioned by what they're exposed to. So I think if they're moving in certain circles, and I certainly believe that the source of accountability and their exposure has increasingly been derived from some element of London. So be it the business community, the press, which is predominantly based in Westminster, and the disconnect between that and the rest of the country, I think is huge. I think politicians are influenced by what happens in London a lot more, and I think that's where we've seen a real schism with the Brexit debate, is that the rest of the country just finds itself isolated and without a voice a lot of the time. And I think politicians, it's not necessarily through any fault of their own, but I think they fall into a trap of listening to a lot of voices that are heavily concentrated in where they spend 5 or 6 days of the week.
It's interesting because I get a very strong from you that, yes, they are out of touch and we've got to do something about it.
Yeah, and I think the only way that you do that is you start adding checks and balances and sources of accountability that aren't based in London. I think that's very simple. And a lot of these guys, be it Labour, Conservative, really, unless their local association really get the hump with them, they're in fairly safe seats. So they've got to do something seriously wrong to actually lose their job. So
no, let's leave the topic for the moment because we've still got to move on to the other ones. But I really do want to know what you think about this. You can vote now. The question is there on my website, themidsonproject.com/episode 2. Just go onto there and you can click, do you agree that politicians are not listening to the public anymore? At the end of each topic, of course, I like to give you places where you can follow up on the issues that we're talking about. But this is one, as Luke was just saying there, this is one of those topics where it's hard to give specific links because those parties are the ones you need to be get involved in. Whichever side of the political spectrum you're on, you want to reach out to them, get involved in it, and start getting the issues that you're concerned about heard by getting involved in those campaigns with those parties too. And you can find every party under the sun, of course, on Google as well. Go and influence it from the inside. Having a look back actually at last week's questions just briefly now to see how you voted. And question 1 was this: should political data mining be banned? Well, 82% of you said yes. More of the results from last week later. Remember, you can vote on today's questions at themidsonproject.com/episode 2. Let's move on to our second question now. When you looked at today's news, do you feel it's slanted or biased? If you think about the stories you read, watched or listened today, did they make it fairly clear who was to blame for the problem? When I started in journalism, the mantra was all about objectivity. Your job was to report the facts, and with that came a responsibility. People trusted journalists. They assumed that what you said was fact and not opinion. But finding the truth and balancing facts is expensive to make for newsrooms and hard to produce as well. And the simple fact is, it is not as engaging to an audience. It simply takes less effort for the mind, for our minds, if a reporter tells us who's to blame. Then we don't have to concentrate in order to weigh up all these facts. We all know that news organisations have adopted this sort of approach, or some news organisations have adopted this sort of approach. And who can blame the commercial ones in particular? But when it comes to the BBC, they're of course not a commercial organisation. You have to pay for the BBC, whether you like it or not. It's the law. And in the rules by which they operate, they're required to be objective and balanced. So when a BBC breakfast reporter recently made comments about Donald Trump and racism, she of course had every right to feel the way she did. That's hard to dispute. But should she have expressed that view on a public broadcaster in the guise of a journalist? Should a journalist be allowed to give an opinion if they're not also subject to the same cross-examination as other guests? When you looked at the fallout of this, as the BBC rebuked the presenter, but then swiftly dropped the rebuke, a few comments from the BBC raised my eyebrows. John Mayer, the co-creator of the BBC's Question Time show, remarked in an article that it was a strong bit of telly. And that's the point, it was. But was it objective journalism? If opinion journalism is so appealing and it's working for other broadcasters, is the pressure to follow suit inevitable? Only this week, ministers once again raised the question of whether the BBC should be optional and whether you should pay for it. Just one final point. The BBC is easy to think of as being one organisation. It is not. It is made up of lots of different parts. And frankly, personally, I've met aggressive BBC journalists who've used every trick in the book to progress their career. But I've also met the vast majority who are honest professional journalists who have incredible insight and balance in their reporting. So let's ask this question for you this week, and I'm going to put this to Luke as well. Is the BBC biased? And secondly, should the BBC be allowed to make good telly but become a paid-for service that you opt into? You can vote now at themidsonproject.com/episode 2. Now I want to bring in Luke on this. Luke, is the BBC biased? What do you think?
Ooh, well, I know it is a common accusation levelled at the BBC, certainly by a lot of,
well, from all sides, in fact, I found, yeah.
Well, that's kind of it, isn't it? I mean, you have poor old Laura Kuenssberg routinely gets abuse from Labour, and then Conservatives say it's biased. And I've got to say, I think part of it is a bit of brinksmanship, actually, because I think a lot of these guys, and I don't know if you've ever read Tim Shipman's book, All Out War on the Brexit campaign, and that's fascinating, actually, because a lot of it is pressure that they're exerting. So if they think the BBC has had a certain slant or given a little bit more coverage to one side the day before, they will put a load of pressure on them and say, oh, look, you gave them a real easy ride yesterday. You've got to give us some more coverage today. So I think it's a bit of brinksmanship, actually, of kind of, oh, come on, you said that about that lot. So you've got to give us a nice story today. And so I think I'm not one of these, actually. I actually fully favour, personally, privatising the BBC, because I don't think it does anything that ITV or Sky isn't really doing. I think they're perfectly objective news outlets as well. But I just think at the end of the day, sometimes facts will upset people, right? So I think that's what they're doing. I've never really looked at anything and thought, oh God, that's a complete lie that they've printed there. Actually, sometimes there are reality upsets people. And
So let's look at those two different points. One about the making it a paid-for service. And the first one, what about journalists giving their opinions? What do you make of that?
Well, there's a difference between a reporter, who I think there needs to be a distinction between the two, right? So I think a reporter, let's be clear, there is a very clear need for reporters who go there and report the events that have happened, simply present the facts, as it were. And then I see absolutely no harm in having. I think Channel 4 actually do the format pretty well. I enjoy watching it, where you do actually have a bit of jockeying and you have a bit of a debate about that, as long as both sides are represented, which they do, to be fair. I think even if you have the journalist with. Or I think it's the anchor usually might have their own bias, or they might throw in their own opinion, or I think sometimes they masquerade that it's their opinion, whereas actually all they're really doing is trying to provoke the debate a little bit. I see no harm in that, as long as both sides are represented. I think that can just make for good television, actually. Is
that the danger point, though? Because the more you get, when you look at the sort of the American media and the way that it's become more polarized, is it the slippery slope? When I was thinking about this topic, and I thought, the BBC actually, as organisations, is incredibly objective compared to news outlets in many places. But is this the danger being the slippery slope when it starts to become opinion-based programming? It makes good telly. Is that the danger?
I don't know. I mean, have you ever watched Sky News or ITN and thought, oh wow, they're really biased just because they have a commercial slant there? So I think culturally we are very different to the US. I think the US they kind of like these out there personalities that are very opinionated, and I actually think there's something different in the British psyche where I think we're pretty good at getting a sense of when someone's just coming in, barging in with a clear agenda, and it gets our backs up. And I actually think we'd switch off from it pretty quickly.
Is that maybe the future, though? Because it's interesting when you look on social media that the kind of, in quotes, news coverage of events is becoming more and more polarised and more angry. And those people are getting a lot of followers. Do you think maybe we're not going to have it for 10 years, but it could be the next generation of news?
I could see it coming full circle. I could definitely see that. I think you are right that this culture of rage and anger is definitely what gets traction at the moment, certainly online, and it makes a lot of sense, right? I think we all travel to work. A lot of people commuting, and you've got this little device that I see it all the time. There's people scrolling through on social media, and what grabs your attention? It's not read the facts about the budget. That's not what jumps out at you, right? It's the budget is going to make you poorer. That's what gets people to think, I'll click on that and I'll read that because I'm angry about this already and I haven't even read it yet. Or even more worryingly, people don't click on it. They just read the headline. I think that's increasingly common. And I think some outlets such as The Independent are really naughty at it. They have a headline that's, when you read the article, is just so far removed from the reality, and that's something that does concern me. I don't think the broadcasters are actually too bad at it. I think they're fairly objective. I think what we're seeing is it's actually the print outlets that I think are so worried because their mode of delivering the news has just been decimated really over the last couple of decades, that they've now thought, oh wow,
so they've had to do anything they could. So for the BBC as a whole, though, your vote on this is that no, they're not biased, or everything has a sort of slant, but overall, no.
Overall, I think the BBC are pretty objective.
Luke, thank you very much. That's question 2. What do you think about that? Make sure you vote on it now. themidsonproject.com/episode 2. What do you think? Is the BBC biased? If you feel the BBC is biased, you can, of course, go to Ofcom, which is the regulator for broadcasters in the UK. That is ofcom.org.uk. But if you agree with the BBC and it being objective, then how about highlighting when people say it's not? How about pointing out how they are balanced on social media yourself? Maybe that's the best way of getting across that point. Let's have another quick look back at last week's questions. The second question we had last week was, should the rules on charity involvement in politics be made stricter or more lenient? 94% of you said more strict. What do you think about that? If someone got in your way on the street and stopped you moving, would it frustrate you? What if they were doing it for fun, just to annoy you? How would you feel then? What if they were doing it to make a political point and it was the only way to get your attention? Would you be prepared to put up with it then? What if they were making a political point you agree with? How would you feel that way? Probably in favour. What if it was a point you disagreed with? You might be rather annoyed. This week, protesters representing Extinction Rebellion, sorry, I stumble over that word all the time, tried to glue themselves to the top of a London Underground train. Commuters had had enough. You could see it in the videos, and they dragged them down. Shortly afterward, Extinction Rebellion said that internally they'd been opposed to this particular move and this particular campaigning technique. The whole point of these protests, of course, is to get media coverage, which allows you to get across your political message. But when the story becomes about the protesters and their image, or the image of commuters losing their temper, has the whole campaign actually just lost this fight? Because no longer are they getting across the message about climate change, but about how it's annoying commuters and about how things are turning to violence. In a democratic country, you of course have a right not to be held up or stopped without due cause. Yet this is exactly what has been happening. Frustrated commuters had had enough. The problem is the idea surely was to change people's attitudes. Yet now that we have this backlash with people taking direct action against them, what happens next? Training camps are organised for protesters like Extinction Rebellion, and they know, for example, that if you refuse to cooperate with police, it takes many more police officers to detain you, and that saps police resources and allows you to protest in a more effective way on the street. It works. So protesting like this definitely grabs the headlines and it gets the media attention. But when it goes too far, what happens then if the message gets lost? So has Extinction Rebellion gone too far? Has this style of protest gone too far? Are things getting to the point where it really will end up with violence? Putting aside the actual point of their campaign about climate change, which we could debate forever, let's talk about the actual campaigning techniques themselves. And bring in Luke here now. What do you think on this? Have they gone too far? And not just Extinction Rebellion, but this kind of protest. What do you think?
Yes, yeah, I certainly think that. Look, I just don't get what they're trying to do, to be honest. In terms of the UK, I think our emissions have almost halved in the last 20, 25 years.
But what about on the actual campaigning techniques itself? And the fact that, where Extinction Rebellion also had an Animal Rebellion as well, involved with it as well, who are using similar techniques to push a vegan message.
I don't think it achieves anything positive at all that isn't achieved through rational debate and presenting your facts in. Look, there are so many channels that you can use, social media, you can write articles and papers and things.
Isn't the argument on this that the only reason that we are talking about climate change is because people have gone and stood in front of things and sent out boats to block nuclear destroyers, etc. Isn't that the reason why? It's because no one was listening and they had to grab our attention, and that's the only way you can do it.
Maybe that was the case at first, but I certainly don't think that's the case now. And I actually think they've done more harm than good to their cause, actually, because a lot of people I know that they don't doubt the science behind climate change, and they're actually, in a lot of cases, kind of liberal-minded people that are proactively doing things about it. They're actually now incredibly annoyed to see just needless disruption to people's daily routine. And actually, I just find, it's all well and good for them to distance themselves from this particular incident, but they have glued themselves to DLR trains in the past. And you just think, hang on, this is an electric-powered form of public transport. If we're so concerned about the environment, why are you disrupting something that is an incredibly environmentally friendly way of traveling to work? I don't understand what they're doing. That there are countries that are polluting on an industrial level. China, India, and I think
But
you look at
in terms of the
big
campaigning
big-
techniques, I think their whole argument would be that we have no choice. It's the only way we can grab people's attention. I was really interested to see there was a TV advert, and I can't remember what supermarket it was, but it started off with a child coming home saying that I want to become a vegan or a vegetarian. And so the fact that a supermarket is now adopting this stance, that message is clearly getting across, isn't it? It's starting to have a change on attitudes and on culture. So you could argue that actually what they're doing, as annoying as it is working for their beliefs.
But I mean, is that as a result of people protesting, or is that simply a supermarket saying, "Well, we've done our market research, and there's more people that are adopting this lifestyle"?
But if they're latching onto a current sort of cultural feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess that maybe they are, but I think ultimately I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think they're simply following a market trend that they're saying, well, that there is growing demand for this kind of product, and I don't think I don't think there is a debate going on about this, and I think there's a lot of facts and debates that are incredibly informative. I think there's material that people are engaging with that's the right way of delivering a message on these things. I don't think people's minds are going to be changed. I actually think the worst thing you can do is just upset people and get people angry, because all they're going to think then is that they're just going to stop listening to you. They're just going to think, well, actually, I find what you're doing and saying is really annoying, and I'm just not going to listen to it. And actually, you might even end up with the opposite. You might end up that they start listening to the other side a bit more and start thinking,
yes. Well, this is the danger, isn't it?
I'm just annoyed at you.
Absolutely.
Now,
of a backlash, yeah.
So I think
But if we move,
paper straws
if we sort of start not just environmentalism, but any kind of campaign, we've seen protests becoming more aggressive, more nasty, haven't we? Particularly in the past few years.
Yeah.
And you just get that feeling that this isn't about to go away. This is actually going to get worse, and people are going to get more and more entrenched.
Yeah,
it's not going to improve debate. We're actually going to get more entrenched, whatever side you're on.
It's a vicious circle, isn't it? I think you can see this in so many areas of conflict, that the moment people stop talking to each other and start shouting at each other, it's just so self-defeating, because all that happens is no one ever changes their mind by being shouted at, do they? All that happens is their views get crystallized even further, and they just think, I can't stand that person.
How do we de-escalate this then? I mean, it's interesting coming back to this point we were first talking about with Brexit, and we were talking about this last week, and some really interesting comments that people were making about, they wanted to throw things at their device because they didn't agree with what was being said, and it's like, but it's that level of passion that it's got to with Brexit as well. How do we de-escalate these sorts of issues that are causing people to get so angry that it can resort to violence?
I think there's two things really. I think one is people need to listen more. I think people are increasingly of the view that the only view they want to listen to is things that reaffirm their worldview, rather than perhaps challenging it, and maybe you walk away from a debate or a particular opinion piece still of the same mind, but nevertheless thinking, yeah, but I understand what they're saying now, actually. And I think that's kind of stopped happening, and I think people have started to get a little bit lazy and lean towards simply listening to people and engaging with content that just reaffirms what they think. I think the second is to be respectful of people, that your opinion isn't the only opinion in the world. And I think that's kind of where the Extinction Rebellion guys haven't done themselves any favors, because I think they've almost adopted an approach that their view is the only right view, that everyone else is wrong, and it doesn't really matter if everyone else's lives are disrupted, because their approach is the only approach. And if we don't start immediately sacrificing our living standards, then we're all wrong and we're all doomed. And I think that's a very apocalyptic and a bit of a silly view to take, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting that I very rarely pay any attention to celebrities, and Ellen DeGeneres said something after there was a photo taken of her laughing with George W. Bush. And people were being critical of how could she laugh with a Republican when she was a Liberal Democrat. And she said, being nice to people, be nice to everyone. That doesn't just mean be nice to people that agree with you. You can disagree with people and still be friends with them. And I have to say that was quite powerful watching that. And I'd never listen to celebrities or care what they say, but that one time I thought it really struck a nerve with where we've got to now. Everyone's so angry, and it's time to actually just accept the fact that sometimes we just have to agree to disagree.
Yeah, and I think that's where politics and the ability to make decisions can just end up in a really bad place, because what happens is where this becomes the kind of discourse is there has to be winners and losers, that one side gets their way, but the other side ends up really badly off and just feeling completely ignored. Whereas actually politics is kind of the art of compromise a lot of the time, is that you need the ability to listen to each other and accept that at some point you're going to meet each other in the middle. And I think that seems to have been something that's gradually eroded over the years, is this kind of refusal to meet the other side anywhere, and we have to be uncompromising. And
yeah, so has it gone too far? What do you think? The midsonproject.com/episode 2. You will find there the poll. And if you agree, of course, with Extinction Rebellion, you can find them on their website, rebellion.earth. That's rebellion.earth. If you disagree, then, finding links is almost impossible, as search engines are dominated by news stories about this. There are no organisations I can find that are actively sort of against this kind of thing, but certainly on social media, you can certainly be expressing your views on how you feel. Now, before our masterclass this week, which Luke is going to share some tips, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, and I will as well, one final look back at last week's questions. In a couple of words only, what will happen if Brexit is cancelled? That was a question we asked. And considering all the latest developments of what's been going on as well, I did ask just a few words. One comment was, the markets will rally, but society will need healing. And interestingly, he said that this would actually be the same whether we had Brexit or whether we didn't have Brexit, the same thing. And another comment we had was this: we will all breathe a sigh of relief if Brexit is cancelled. The economy will be saved, but we must reach out to Leave voters and not be smug. They were fooled into voting Leave, and none of this is their fault. Luke, any thoughts on that one? I think I'll wrap that one pretty. You can vote now, of course, for this week's questions on the midsonproject.com/episode 2. It is next time for the masterclass. Now, if you've been sitting there thinking, I want to get involved in one of these issues or another issue that's close to your heart, this show wants to help you do that. Whatever the issue is, whatever perspective you have, whether on the left or right or somewhere else altogether, every week I'm going to be asking my guests for their campaigning techniques. So let's begin this week's political masterclass. And Luke, I want you to share something with us. You are obviously from the Conservative side of things, but a lot of what you're teaching with Conservative Progress in terms of encouraging activists to get involved applies whatever your campaign ideas are, aren't they, Kurt?
Yeah. I've got to say, though, I think the first discipline that people really need to master, because look, I've seen a lot of activists come and go, and I've got to say the ones that are successful and get on, the trait that they have is one, frankly, determination, and the second is patience. These things don't happen overnight. You don't become an MP overnight. You don't become a councillor overnight. And likewise, just take it away from politics. I've been a trustee on a charity, and you don't walk into a local charity and tell all these people who've been doing it for 20 years, I've got these views and you're going to do things so much better. Actually, you're far better off just taking things in from people that have been there for a little while and kind of learning what they do, learning from them, and chipping in with ideas. And as I say, being patient. Don't walk into these places and expect to change the world overnight, but be patient. Just chip away at it. And
so, if you had a sort of action plan
when you don't get your way straight away.
Yeah. So if you had an action plan, if you got someone watching this right now who's going, look, I want to get involved in this and I want to change these particular issues, what would be your advice? How should they go and action that today?
Wow. So I think there are so many ways of changing things. I think you can obviously.
Let's try one. What's the first bit of advice you would give if someone walked up to you in a pub and said, how do I do this? Do they go to their local party and say, how do I get involved, or what do they do if they've got a particular issue that they're concerned about?
Look, from my perspective, I would say get involved in the local party, because I think the raft of things that you can change from getting involved in local politics are huge, actually. It gives you a platform as well. It gives you a platform, and crucially, public money as well, that you can actually start having a say over how that's spent and allocated. So I certainly think that is one of the forms. But then, look, you can be a trustee on a charity. You can get involved. The local park down the road from me has a friends group where they do great little things. They have a little vegetable plant and a little plot, and they organise events in the park. So look, these things can be. A lot of people live in flats. You've probably got resident directors. If you're passionate about what's going on in your local flat, join the local residents directors. There are so many things. Okay, yeah, it's a time commitment. It's not all going to be great fun, but
if you want to make a difference, that's what it's going to take, isn't it?
Making a difference is an effort, right? You don't just rock up to these things and suddenly
it takes an effort.
You've got to win over people. You've got to win them over to your way of thinking. You have to be, at times, bite your tongue. Someone might be saying something that you really disagree with, but the best way to change their way of thinking is not to go in all guns blazing and say you think they're talking a load of rubbish.
So to sum it up, if you're concerned about an issue, there is some organisation which you can get involved in where you can start to actually make a difference, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and it depends. As I say, these things can be really close to home. It might be, something that's there might be an organisation running something on your local high street. There might be the directors of your flat block. There are so many little things that you don't have to be looking to change the world. You can just change your immediate surroundings and have an active say. It doesn't have to be big, but still, even with these smaller things, just be patient. I think that's the main thing that I would really encourage people when they get involved with these kind of things.
Superb, Luke. Thank you. My tip for this week is about press releases. And my main thing here, because I used to be a journalist, is what actually is your story? You can probably go on for hours about an issue that you're concerned about. But from a journalist point of view, they need to know in a couple of words what it is that you're trying to get across and why that is interesting. So once you've written down what your main message is, cut it down and cut it down and cut it down until you've got it in one sentence. And that's the line. And ideally, it's literally going to be like sort of 5-6 words long that sums up your entire story. Because if you can't encapsulate it in that, you will not get a journalist's attention. Make sure you put that at the top of your press release. That's a line that will grab their attention. And then another question, another question I get asked as well, which is a real simple one I can throw in as well, is what does embargo mean? Embargo simply means that it's a request to news organisations not to run a story until the date that you put next to the word embargo. So you might say embargo till Friday, the 5th of November, something like that. It is not compulsory. There is no law behind it. And if an organisation doesn't see you as being, or doesn't feel that they particularly need to worry about you if you get upset, they may well completely ignore it. But embargo is an easy way to give journalists a story so that they can write it up, get it all done, and then release it on that particular day. But the main message today is, what is your story? Write it down however long it takes, and then condense it, keep editing it until you've got it down to a really short sentence. Thank you very much to Luke for joining us today. It has been really, really interesting talking about these topics. What are you up to next, Luke?
Got to go feed the puppy, I think. Feed the puppy and take him out for his business.
Right, okay. Nothing political at all then.
No, get ready for work.
So that's it for this week. What do you think should be the topics in the next show? What's getting under your collar? What could you perhaps come on the show and tell us about too? Tell me at themidsonproject.com, or you can go on Twitter at The Midson Project. Don't forget to like and subscribe the podcast as well, and I will see you very soon.